Welcome, everyone, to the Future of Worker Financial Security, the Nexus of Work and Benefits. My name is Sarika Abbey, and I'm an Associate Director at the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program. We are so excited you could join us today for this event, co-hosted by the Financial Security Program and WorkRise. The Financial Security Program's mission is to illuminate and solve the most critical financial challenges facing American households, and to make financial security for all a top national priority. We aim for nothing less than a more inclusive economy with reduced wealth inequality and shared prosperity. WorkRise is a research to action network on jobs, workers, and mobility, hosted by the Urban Institute, with a mission of rebuilding a more equitable and resilient labor market that expands opportunity and economic mobility for workers, especially Black and other workers of color. This event is supported by the funders of WorkRise and funders of Aspen Financial Security's program's research on the complete financial lives of workers, which includes the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, JP Morgan Chase and Company, the Prudential Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. For many workers, work does not and has not for decades guaranteed their financial stability and security. At the Financial Security Program, we have adopted as our definition of financial security the description of financial well-being established by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, a state of being wherein a person can fully meet current and ongoing financial obligations, can feel secure in their financial future, and is able to make choices that allow them to enjoy life. In 2020, we released a new financial security framework to understand and address the challenges of household financial insecurity. We identified the 3 pillars that people need sufficient access to in order to achieve financial security: routinely positive cash flow, personal resources, and public and private benefits. The very foundation of financial security is routinely positive cash flow, with income that exceeds expenses. This not only helps households create a financial cushion for short-term emergencies, but also supports them to pay down debt, build longer-term savings, and make financial decisions for the well-being of their household. But even before this pandemic, nearly half of all US workers earned wages too low to cover basic living expenses. And we know that no one achieves financial security entirely on their own, relying on foundational supports from our public and private system of benefits to stabilize, build assets, and protect from large economic shocks. But prior to the pandemic, these systems were not meeting the needs of millions of workers, disproportionately excluding workers of color, low-wage workers, and workers in non-traditional work arrangements. And the pandemic shed light on how broken, fragmented, antiquated, and insufficient these systems truly are, and their lack of responsiveness and accountability to workers during an economic crisis. A Gallup's 2020 Great Jobs Survey found that COVID-19 resulted in nearly half of the lowest income workers being laid off, either temporarily or permanently. And more than half of those who were laid off during the pandemic, even if it was temporary, reported a decline in their current overall job quality as measured across 11 dimensions, including pay, benefits, stability, and safety. So while we are starting to see the economy recover, the financially precarious nature of workers' lives before the pandemic and today signals that inclusive recovery requires that we make changes to our systems that have failed millions of workers, reimagining work and benefit systems that are centered on workers, their financial security, and their economic dignity. The importance of this need to reimagine our system of benefits led the Financial Security Program to launch Benefits 21 last year, an initiative I feel fortunate to lead that is taking an integrated, holistic approach to modernizing our system of public and private benefits. We recognize that this type of approach is critical to ensuring workers recover in a more equitable way from this pandemic. And centering a system of benefits on workers means taking an evidence-based approach that looks at the relationship between work, our system of benefits, and financial security, that integrates workers, their voice and power into the design and delivery of the system, and that engages the entire ecosystem of stakeholders, including policymakers, employers, benefit administrators and providers, foundations, and nonprofits to reimagine their role and help redesign a system that ensures all workers can thrive. COVID-19 exacerbated the financial fragility of workers, but also highlighted the urgency and the need for systemic changes. This moment requires us to bring stakeholders together, roll up our sleeves, and utilize our collective energy to design and advance new solutions that center on supporting workers to stabilize and prosper. We are looking forward to doing this today in our panel discussion, digging deeper into this nexus of work and benefits and examining the way diverse stakeholders can build the on-ramps to financial security and economic mobility for workers. Throughout the panel, if you have any questions for the panelists, please submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom center of the screen. We'll be live tweeting from @AspenFSP and @WorkRise Network, and you can join the conversation with #AspenFSPLive. I'm so excited to now introduce our moderator for today's panel, Elizabeth Jacobs. Elizabeth, please turn on your camera. Elizabeth is a senior fellow at the Urban Institute, the deputy director of WorkRise, and fortunately for us, a member of our leadership advisory group for Benefits 21.
Thanks so much, Sarika. It's such a delight to be joining you all today on behalf of WorkRise. We are a research to action network that aims to build a more equitable and resilient labor market in order to expand opportunity and mobility for all workers. And I'll try and keep my intro of WorkRise really brief, but this panel and the topic is so foundational to who we are and what we do that I want to say a little bit about us institutionally as we are new. We bring together employers, advocates, policymakers, practitioners, philanthropists with researchers in order to identify open research questions and to invest in research with the potential to transform the lives of workers. We believe that by bringing together a diverse set of stakeholders, with this panel being a great example, that we can identify questions, lift up existing evidence, and really have the potential to create transformational change at a time when arguably we need it more than ever. So with that brief intro, I want to now invite our panelists to join me. You three can turn your cameras on and I'll give very brief intros so that we can jump straight into the conversation. Anmol Chadha leads the Equitable Futures Lab at the Institute for the Future in Palo Alto, California, which develops solutions to the problems of social inequality in response to ongoing economic and technological transformations. He's currently managing the California Future of Work Commission, created by Governor Gavin Newsom, to develop a broad agenda to promote economic equity in California, and I know we'll hear more about that later. Shada Elmi is a research program manager at the Aspen Institute Financial Security Program. Shada manages FSP's Consumer Insights Collaborative, which is an effort across 9 nonprofits to collectively understand and amplify data about the financial lives of low and moderate income households. And finally, Deborah Plusha Moore is the principal and founder of the Plusha Moore Group. She's also one of the nation's foremost authorities in the fields of diversity, equity, access, and inclusion, executive advising, leadership development, governance, human resources, and organizational development. Basically, if you want to run a functional organization, you should get to know Deborah because she is a powerhouse. So thank you all for joining us. I want to start with a really brief, wide open question that I'll toss out to all of you and give you a chance to get us started, which is, what do we know about worker financial security today? And I'll give you some sub-questions to run with just to give us some meat. What did the pandemic reveal about supports needed, sources of those support, and where are there still knowledge gaps that are hindering what we know? So I'll let you bite off any piece of that just to get us going with some meat. Shada, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. So to help set the stage for the discussion today, I want to open by sharing some of the key findings from our recent report that drew from empirical evidence from the Consumer Insights Collaborative, or the CIC, other organizations, as well as national research and data. Many of my remarks will be pulling from this new report that I'm sure will be shared in the chat. So what do we know about worker financial security today? First, we know that most households in the United States are not financially secure. And as it was mentioned earlier, routinely positive cash flow, where income regularly exceeds the cost of basic expenses, is out of reach, despite it being a critical foundation for financial security. This is because for many non-wealthy Americans, they're facing the twin pressures of stagnating wages and a rising cost of living. In the United States, the opportunity to earn income from work has long been understood as a route to financial security and the antidote to poverty. But for many workers in America today, that just isn't the reality. What we see instead is that there is a two-tiered system of employment in the US, with higher paying jobs being more likely to also provide workers with robust workplace benefits. On the other hand, at the lower end of the pay scale, millions of workers do not have access to the same important workplace benefits, such as healthcare, retirement, and paid leave. So not only are higher paid workers making more money, they also are more likely to be able to participate and contribute more to the benefits that can provide financial stability, which then compounds the differences in financial outcomes between workers in these two groups. Ultimately, what this means is that employment alone doesn't guarantee financial security in the US. Low-wage work is increasingly common. The Brookings Institution estimates that there are 53 million Americans with median hourly wages of about $10 and median annual earnings of about $18,000. And paired with that, more and more workers are finding themselves in these lower paid positions with few, if any, benefits, and fewer if you also consider whether they are affordable and of high quality. And that is because workplace benefits in the United States are primarily discretionary in nature, meaning that benefits are not reaching millions of workers, including a large proportion of that 53 million low-wage workforce, the more than 61 million workers of color, and the 15 million non-standard workers, those that are working in temporary or on-call workers, for example. And that's typically where we pull in the conversation to public benefits, those that are able to kind of fill in that gap between what people earn and what they need to meet their basic needs. Public benefits include public assistance programs that households qualify for, sometimes by having income below a specific threshold. This includes programs like nutrition and housing, utility assistance, also Medicaid. But only some programs have enough funding to actually support all of those that qualify. Some programs are time limited, others are more generous, so the ability to get by really depends on what access you have to those programs. And while public benefits are critical for millions of workers, they are often not enough. Public benefits reduce levels of poverty in the United States by about half, yet even when accessed, households often struggle to make ends meet because those programs are not necessarily meant to cover full needs. A large proportion of workers are having to supplement their pay with public benefits. And this isn't some small niche group of people. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that nearly half of all working recipients of public benefits are actually working full time. So the bottom line is, this means that public benefits, and especially the programs that we consider the safety net, are a critical complement to pay and workplace benefits for workers, and the three must be considered together as we look to the full package of what workers today need.
Great. Anmal, I'm going to call on you next to give us a sense of your view from California.
Yeah, thank you so much for this, and thanks for organizing this panel. I think what Shada outlined was a very great and extremely useful overview of what the current context of financial security looks like for workers. I think in California, which I think is not so different from the rest of the country, we've faced what I think there's a sense of economic crisis in California that predates that's not just about COVID and that it's not limited to just the pandemic, but I think we're familiar with this idea of, with the crisis of inequality, of course. We know there's a housing crisis in California, there's been an environmental crisis. for years. But I think what we also need to put on the table now is what's essentially a job quality crisis. And some of the data that Shada mentioned, all these problems that we're talking about around benefits and worker financial security, I think they're fundamentally related to questions around job quality. And so it's, partly, in large part, it is wages, but benefits are an important part of that picture as well. Shada mentioned a survey from Gallup that recently came out. There's an earlier version of that survey from even before the pandemic that found that only 40% of all workers were in jobs that are considered good jobs, using the metrics and index of about 10 or 11 different factors: pay, consistent hours, scheduling, having some say over the conditions in their work, having a sense of voice or power at work. And I think we need to be thinking about these questions around job quality more seriously. And I think another important thing that I think is really important from what Jada laid out, right, is that often what we think about, what comes up in these conversations around jobs and work and policy discussions or policy debates, is often people move to the question of skills and training as a sort of catch-all solution for all these problems, that could help workers move up for upward mobility. And I think what's really important about the framing of the discussion that we've had here is that this is clearly not going to be solved by focusing on worker skills or workers training alone. And I can talk more about that later, but we're really looking at upgrading jobs themselves, not just upgrading workers. So jobs need to come with wages, benefits, and provide that bigger package of economic security that implicates the role of employers as well as the public social safety net.
Great. Deborah, I wonder if you could give us your perspective on this, particularly from the employer standpoint. I know you've thought a lot about employer-provided benefits and how that all fits into this bigger picture. How does that fit in? What's gone on during COVID? What should we know from how employers are thinking?
Thank you for this important conversation, and I have been impressed with every word, every sentence, and every expert opinion. This is a topic that has long been a creative tension in the United States, and I'm going to keep us focused in the United States. I understand the international impact of work and how it's influenced and how profits are presented and made. But I'd like to, from my perspective, keep this as a domestic issue. And as I look at it domestically, this is the creative tension and intersections of capitalism and socialism. And it's not an either or, it is an and. And it is about being able to pay people in a reasonable approach to live a healthy and meaningful life, and that their hours of work are in line with their compensation. So prior to opening Plusha Moore Group, I was a chief human resources officer for a major health system in the Southeast. And my wake-up call was a report that was put out regarding economic mobility. I lived in a city that if you were born poor, you would stay poor because there was no economic mobility. So employers had this awakening that, as we were saying, this was a fabulous city to live, raise a family, thrive, and develop inside the city as leaders and contributors. We weren't looking at a segment of the population that was struggling every single day. So it was with intent that we looked at issues of minimum wage, knowing that it wasn't our national minimum wage that had us competing for talent. Clearly it was more. And, we looked at $15 as employers, and we understood it was probably closer to $20 an hour that would pull people into a reasonable life. So that is one perspective. The other perspective is it is also the benefits. So many employers present you with benefit packages, and you have the ability to opt out. And the real issue is there should be no opting in, there should be no opting out. It is a total compensation, and it is not about the current time, it's about future. And making those benefits and compensation a total package so employees really do understand at the moment they're hired and throughout their employment career, what are they earning, what are they saving for, and how does it impact their family with financial security. So I agree with the Biden administration that no one should be working a full-time job and still living in poverty. So we still believe in the class system. What COVID taught us was we have to be thoughtful about the entire workforce when we're talking about an infectious disease, and if we're talking about moving beyond our current health state, we're all engaged and we're all impacted. So if we look at the financial structures of organizations, it's about profit and loss. It's about days of cash on hand. It's about revenues and how that is all taken in consideration when we're looking at the investment in human capital. So I believe that our workforce is not an expense, it's an investment. And when you're investing in our workforce, you're investing in community. You invest in community, you invest in talent. And they're just structural issues that we need to address that would allow greater education, greater access, and a better understanding of what total compensation, pay, benefits, and assistance mean. It's a puzzle, and we've made it really difficult. So after you've been through your career, I would imagine you will have 4 or 5 401k plans. How do you understand them? And how do you link them together? Upon my recent retirement, I feel like I've been running a benefits office for my family. So we've made it too complicated, state by state, employer by employer. There has to be some policy and government influence to take down the complexity of how you earn and what benefits you gain so people can understand what they are earning, how they save, and how they can more adequately predict their lives. And so being a woman and a woman of color, I understand the impact. I also understand we are gig workers. We had a job, we had a little side job. We didn't, we could be getting assistance. How we tie those things together and value all the contributions. So I appreciate this conversation so much, and I look forward to the questions and additional comments.
Thanks to all of you. That was a really helpful way to get us started. And I want to note, keep track of kind of threads that I hope we can come back to throughout. Just in 2 things that I heard, and Deborah, you touched on this directly at the end of your comments. We think a lot about the employer-employee relationship, but what it means to be a worker has really shifted over time in ways that we could have a whole conversation as to the shape and size of the gig economy. But I think it goes without saying that we understand as a country that employment relationships are much more complicated than the kind of flat version that we saw before. So I want to just highlight that because I know you all have thought about this, and I think it'll come up periodically. And then the other point, and this is very kind of WorkRise serving, because part of what we're designed to do is really identify gaps in the knowledge and then invest in driving the field forward to actually fill those knowledge gaps. So there are a couple of places I heard as you all were giving your answers where there was a like kind of here's where we need to go. And I suspect there's a here's what we need to know in order to go there. But I will just highlight that to keep in mind, and I might push a little bit more on that going forward. But I want to take us to something that was an implicit in a lot of what each of you said, which is that there's a lot of variation in worker financial security across demographic groups, particularly race. We all, I think, are well aware of that, and it's become absolutely impossible for anyone who didn't have that front and center to not have that as a main focus. In my view, that's a good thing. So we have a lot of productive work we can do there, but also gender, immigration status. These are all things that intersected in really important and consequential ways during the pandemic, but arguably beforehand, were really shaping workers' lives in dramatically different ways. So I'd like to give you all some space to talk about what we should do, how we should think about both the problems, but also the solutions across these different groups, how they vary and how the solutions may or may not vary depending on the nature of the problem. Shada, I know you have pictures for us, so I'm gonna let you take the first cut just to get us oriented and then turn it over to Deborah and Amal to jump in.
Awesome, appreciate it. As is so often the case, we see these differential impacts and outcomes. I think everybody's kind of touched on this when we look at race and ethnicity, gender, immigration status. I think it's important to note that these demographics are really difficult to disentangle from the types of jobs that people find themselves in. So, you know, for the last 40 years, wages have stagnated for low and middle income earners, but that wage growth has been even slower when we're able to disentangle it and look at Latinx and Black workers and other marginalized communities. Part of that is because the people that are overrepresented in non-standard arrangements, such as temporary, on-call, and subcontracted work, these are jobs that often have lower pay, limited access to workplace benefits. These people that are there are workers of color, are women, are immigrants, are people with disabilities. Workers that are facing employment barriers, like those without documentation or the formerly incarcerated, are also more likely to hold these positions. So all of that limits people's ability to save, to invest, to build their financial cushions, and it also leaves them more vulnerable to financial shocks. It makes it harder for people to move to financial stability, let alone financial security, and ideally upward economic mobility. And the BLS projects that low-wage jobs are expected to grow, meaning that work alone is unlikely to meet the needs of those people that are finding themselves in these lower-paid positions. To help situate this, I do want to share one figure from our recent report. So let me do that. And meanwhile, that's great. So to help situate this, I am showing you all a figure from our recent report, which is a matrix of work arrangements and benefit receipts. So up and down, you see various categories related to a person's employment or attachment to an employer. And across the top in the blue, the benefits that they are or are not receiving. What we see in the blue is the likelihood of financial security. In other words, in our current, what we see in the blue is that kind of, where people are landing in their financial security. And what we also notice is that only one box shown up there in the top right is indicating financial security. So in other words, in our current system of work and benefit arrangements, only one type of worker, higher income, full-time employees receiving workplace benefits, stands a reasonable shot at financial security. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, the share of workers in this situation is declining as companies are turning more to part-time workers, contracting out more functions, more of the kind of core functions of work, and then relying more on non-standard workers. So as we start to think about solutions, we need to take these realities into account to examine the ways that we can meet workers where they are, and then change the underlying supports to shift the likelihood from financial precarity towards stability and ideally security that people end up finding themselves in based on their different positions in this matrix. I'll stop there.
That's great. So Amal, I want to turn it to you because I know you've spent time in the data on this, and I don't want to put you on the spot, so you don't need to quote exact numbers, but I wonder if you can say a little bit, either from California or more generally, how if you lay the racial distribution of workers onto Shada's matrix, what would that look like? And I'll let Deborah, you take a crack at this too, kind of what might explain why workers fall across the distribution or across that matrix in the way they do by race and other demographic factors? And multi-part question, what does that imply for how we ought to be thinking about solutions?
Yeah, that's great. No, I think that, what's clear from the data is that we have clear, either whether it's occupational segregation or labor market segmentation, where by racial groups, workers of color, women, and immigrant workers are much more likely to be in jobs that are low wage, that are low paying jobs, that don't provide benefits, that don't provide the sort of financial security that we're focusing on today. And I think what's important is that whether it's care work or domestic work and other industries that we know are historically low paying, these, especially domestic work and care work, have been historically excluded from a lot of standard workplace protections that were meant to improve job quality, right? Is that this isn't just a natural process, right? It's not that these workers have somehow sorted themselves into the lowest paying jobs, the most insecure jobs. I think there are, we know that these are shaped by policy, right? So that's in the way that domestic workers and agriculture workers, for example, have been excluded from a lot of the standard workplace protections. And I think it's not a coincidence that we see primarily workers of color, a lot of women in the care industries and domestic work, and immigrant workers, of course. And I think in some ways the arrow goes the other way, right? So it's not, it may be the case, or I think it's likely the case that it's because these are the workers that are in these industries and jobs that we find that they're actually quite low paid, right? We know from the research that as occupations become more dominated by women, for example, the quality of those jobs declines, right? That they're either stagnant wages or the wages are reduced, benefits, other aspects of compensation that produce economic security are weakened because they become identified as women's work or women's jobs. And that's the same is true for immigrant jobs, right? A lot of what people have traditionally called low skilled work, which is really very rarely low skilled at all, but is in fact low paying work or low compensated work or low wage work. So I think it's impossible these are inextricably linked, these demographic factors, and we know that that it maps on almost perfectly with different, whether it's racial disadvantage, gender, immigration status, and your likelihood of being in a job. In California, we were just interested in seeing who are the people in the low wage workforce that we mentioned earlier today. And I think we were struck by a few things. One, we weren't surprised that there are racial disparities, but we were surprised that in some areas of the state, like in Fresno and some other metro areas, fully 1/2 of all Latino workers make less than $15 an hour in California, which is, again, probably the most expensive state to live in. But literally half of Latino workers in Fresno will make less than $15 an hour. Women are more likely to make less than $15 an hour, of course. And we were actually surprised overall that workers making less than $15 an hour, about 1/5 actually have college degrees, which is sort of flies in the face, again, of our notions of skills and training and education as a path for upward mobility.
So I would lean in by saying, I agree. There is nothing shocking or surprising, and now we have the data. So I was looking in the Q&A column, and we've always actually had the data, but now we have a forum to discuss where do we want to be, and you want tools. So my experience led me to what's reasonable for the community, for the organization, for the workforce, what's reasonable. So I always created a reasonable wage. No one in the organization would get paid less than this amount, which was reasonable for that economy. So in addition to that, if you are in human resources or an employer and you're looking to predict and forecast, we all know the number. So, in my former community, over years, what we said was $15 by 2020 for every major employer. So we did that from an employer standpoint, but also women in the community backed the philosophy. So every time we had an opportunity to be in front of a CEO or to be in front of board members or people of influence, chamber meetings, it was our tag, $15 by 2020. The major employers got there by 2020. I was no longer there, but it was so deeply rooted in how to advance this community that we made that initiative. So every voice counts in this. And if you are an HR professional in this conversation and you think, well, if I bring this up, I'm going to get struck down. Well, what I would say to you is you can get back up. So if you do a great job in your human resources capacity, think of the broader impact that you can have with ideas that engage the workforce, produce loyalty produce the opportunity to retain and produce a higher level of activity and presence in your workforce, because you're taking some of those insecurities away. So if people understand if they work, they will earn, they'll have access to benefits. And I really appreciate the banks. Many of the national banks are running financial security programs for employers. That was, I'm not expert at that, but the national banks have partnered, and they created education, platforms for learning, and relationships with the employees that needed it the most. So, it's staying vigilant as a human resources professional, as professionals in your organization, staying vigilant as high-ranking people with decision-making. Clearly, we were paid based on our commitment to work. And I would say, how do you take that throughout the entire organization? How do we improve the life experience and quality of life of the entire workforce? And, they're giving their best. And how do we as employers respond to that with not only their current understanding of financial security, but their long-term? So it always breaks my heart where people can't retire. And what we know is that over time, there will be a need to retire or to find different assistance. So do we invest now or do we invest later? And do we hold people responsible and accountable for understanding their own financial security, their financial health, their personal health? What are we going to do about health care? And allow them to make decisions short and long term with good information.
Thank you. So this is implicit in a lot of what you three have all shared, but I want to make it explicit and kind of push on it a little bit. When we talk about good paying jobs, when we talk about quality jobs, often that's shorthand for a job with a decent wage. But one of the sometimes implied, sometimes explicit threads of this conversation is a wage isn't sufficient. There are a lot of other pieces that we're not going to leave it on a well-paid employee to figure out how to build a healthcare system or to fill in the blank, or how to manage their time when their employer is also trying to manage their time and work effort. So that's a leading question in some ways, but I want to tee it up for you all to talk a little bit about why not focus on just paychecks? Why focus on these other components of where financial security comes from for workers? I'll let Deborah go ahead. I was going to let Shada jump in because she's got a framework, but I don't want to interrupt. So
no, Shada, you
okay.
go.
Shada, I'll let you go. I'll let you go.
I look forward to responding. I have an opinion.
Clearly, all of us have a lot to say. So I think, the matrix I shared earlier helps tell part of this story, that wages alone are not the only factor that matters. We're seeing how many other systems are at play here. And if we didn't know it before, then the pandemic has really taught us why this is a really big problem. It served as this large-scale stress test on the economy. It showed us why it is so precarious to tie these critical supports to the workplace. It's revealed the risk that the US as a society undertook by conditioning the provision of these essential benefits, especially health insurance, to the workplace. As millions of people were losing their jobs and their main sources of income, those lucky enough to have health insurance and other workplace supports were also simultaneously losing those. We also know that the pandemic did not affect people equally. Anmol has already mentioned the occupational segregation has led to certain people being more impacted, finding themselves in specific jobs that put them more at risk, whether that was for job losses or in this case, it was to COVID-19 exposure. So, because demographics are so closely tied to work sectors, we're seeing differences based on the type of sector people were in. Groups like folks that are Hispanic, low income, and younger individuals, for instance, were more likely to be affected by unemployment and mass layoffs. On the other hand, Black workers were overrepresented in industries such as healthcare, which were less affected by job loss. And while on the front end, that might seem like great, they still have their income, this ended up being this double-edged sword. While they were able to maintain an income, they were also more likely to be in jobs that didn't allow for teleworking or that did not offer quality and robust workplace benefits, meaning that they were at risk of COVID exposure by continuing to have to go into work, and then particularly vulnerable to both the health and the financial impacts of the pandemic. So, for instance, for low-wage workers, of which women, people of color, and all of these folks in marginalized communities are overrepresented, they have few, if any, sick days, or potentially, and another piece that we're probably not going to be able to really dive into here, but just an inability, even if they have those days, to use them without risking job loss. So beyond the harm to these workers and their families, in this situation, this inequitable access to paid leave, paid sick leave in particular, is a nationwide vulnerability as the world is contending with this public health crisis, where keeping sick people home is really critical.
Thanks. Deborah, I'll let you jump in now, and then I want to turn to Anma.
Absolutely, thank you. And your conversation and statistics regarding COVID and the impact of people of color and women, you are absolutely on target. And then I want to take it another level. I read this great article in the New York Times at the impact of COVID on all women was substantial compared to men. It's been horrific for everyone, but it was the women who were doing the house cleaning, the hairstylists, the transportation, meeting income needs that got knocked out of being able to work and earn. So when you are working independently and don't have access to health and retirement and any other typical traditional employer benefit, it knocks you out of the access to good health and financial security. So it was the double-edged sword for women and for women of color and for women doing independent contract work. So, everybody's always talking about the hustle. So the hustle brings dollars, but the hustle doesn't bring access to life benefits, health, retirement, being able to have access to healthy food. So, it's really kind of looking at the whole as opposed to fragmenting and valuing specific categories of the workforce. And, this goes back to how we value people and how we value their work.
So I have so many more questions myself that I could keep on pummeling you all with. We could probably talk all afternoon, but we have a variety of really excellent questions that folks have put in the Q&A. So I want us to turn us to that. And I'm going to start with one that I'm going to give to Amal, because I think it will also give you a chance to tell us some of the key takeaways from your work with the California Future of Work Commission. I know you had a number of evidence-driven recommendations that came out of that coalition's work. And I suspect that will dovetail nicely with this question, which is asking whether there are targeted equity-centered approaches to financial security. Are there conversations happening about how we do this? And there's some examples: an equitable compensation package for workers with children that take into account the higher expenses of healthcare and childcare, or potentially reparations that take into account the structural racism that's created some of the segregation, wage disparities, and job quality disparities we've been talking about. I know that you and the Governor's Commission spent a lot of time grappling with how to tackle all of these issues with equity front and center in your recommendations. So tell us a little bit about how that worked in the context of this question.
Yeah, so I think, just first stepping back a little bit more broadly, the Future Work Commission in California, it was, coming on, there had been sort of several years of discussions around the future of work from different policy institutes, foundations, and other players as well. And I think we, just as our sort of background framework, we had thought that a lot of the conversation had been dominated very much by these concerns around technological change, and especially automation and the threat of job loss from automation. And I think from our perspective, we wanted to be able to add something different or to take a slightly different approach. And there are a few key things to our framework. One was, we thought that the effects of technological change and automation, they're not predetermined and they're not inevitable, right? That they play out within a certain policy context, within a social context. And that through public policy, we're actually able to shape how these things play out, right? We are able to shape, where the gains of technological change are, how they're distributed, who should be able to benefit from this. And I think we really wanted to move past this idea of, this looming robot apocalypse, right? That all of our jobs are going to be destroyed and replaced by robots. There's not going to be work for anybody to do. And I think the insight was that in many ways, technological change is much more likely to lead to reduce job quality, right, than it is to lead to widespread job loss. And I think when we started thinking, we also wanted to, I mentioned that I think we're facing an inequality crisis in California and elsewhere as well. And so we wanted to, frame the work around the future work into a broader or more expansive vision of economic equity, so that the question wasn't so much what are the jobs what jobs are we going to be doing in the future, what are we going to be doing for work in the future, but clearly jobs and work, as we've seen this discussion today, haven't met the needs that we've needed them to meet so far. And so the question we were really led by is, what is it that we want work and jobs to do for us in the future? How is it that work and jobs can pay sufficient wages for people that are working in California? How can they create the sort of economic security that we're here to talk about today? And I think at a very high level, thinking about job quality, we hold, today we think about manufacturing jobs as the sort of gold standard of job quality, of a good job, good middle-class job, especially one that's available to people without, maybe that don't have a college degree, where they're able to, earn enough to support their families, to have this sort of solid middle-class economic security. And in a way, it's interesting because manufacturing jobs didn't used to be good jobs, right? They were terrible jobs. They had low pay, terrible working conditions. They didn't even have basic protections for child workers, right? And we made those bad jobs into good jobs. And there's not, we did that through policy changes, and really importantly, through workers organizing and increasing their power in the workplace to demand for better working conditions and for that economic security. And so there's nothing inherent in manufacturing. There's nothing inherent in making things, right? Durable goods. That means those had to be good jobs. They were bad jobs and they became good jobs through, policy changes and workers organizing. And so similarly, when we look at our job quality crisis today, we look at retail jobs and care work and domestic work and things like that. There's nothing inherent in being a domestic worker or providing, working in the service sector. That means those have to be low-paying jobs that don't provide economic security. And just like in the past, we've made bad jobs into good jobs, we can do that again with the jobs that Shada mentioned are going to be growing in the future. They're mainly, service sector jobs, retail, care work, and things like that.
So Shada, I want to turn it to you to kind of twist this question a little bit and to get your thoughts on the different roles for the different institutional actors that Amal's touched on here. And Deborah, I'm going to turn to you to ask specifically about the employer piece and also your broader take. But we've got, a role for government, we've got a role for employers, we've got a role for individual workers, arguably, and there's probably other institutions too that I'm missing, but I'd kind of take those three as the three big spaces. And arguably what we're looking toward and what we've been talking about is really needing to be smart about how we rethink the relative roles of those three forces based on the evidence of what's worked and what hasn't worked. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more based on your diving into the data, the consumer insights group, et cetera, on how you see that balance and where you see that going, particularly in light of all of the movement here in Washington and certainly in the States as well in terms of policy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a really critical question and something that Deborah and Emma will probably have really specific answers to. So I will say that, the part of what we learned and that was really made clear during the course of just writing this report, honestly, was just seeing how many people were fitting into which boxes, right? So understanding that people are finding themselves across this, trajectory based on where they fit unemployment, based on what benefits they have, and the kind of idea that we can move people from these different positions, but that each of them may require different levers, different actors. I think COVID really demonstrated to us that philanthropy and that government can really step in, and when they do, there is an opportunity to really move the needle for folks in a way that maybe we didn't think was possible before. We saw cash infusions used on a scale that we haven't seen in the US, at least recently. And those helped workers stabilize their cash flow and build up cushions in the midst of this uncertainty. In addition, we knew before that having liquid savings prior to the pandemic was really important, but those that did have those were able to weather the resulting economic shocks. So research found that from Commonwealth and others found that those with savings set aside were able to avoid taking on credit card debt, borrow, they didn't have to postpone bills. They were able to save more of their stimulus check funds. So not only did previous savings help people withstand the pandemic, they also promoted the accumulation of savings that provided them more stability and more security. So I think that is an opportunity for employers to think about benefits. That is an important place where product designers and others can step in and really support folks. That is a place where government can step in. So there are places, but I think one important piece is just recognize what the current situation is. And I think we have an opportunity to change this system for the better. We should not mistake this current system and the benefits that are being provided as the only system of work and benefits. I think this is something that both Deborah and Anmol have said much more succinctly and better than I. But I think that's a really important piece of this puzzle. And the other thing I will say is, no amount of employee financial wellness programs can make up for the prevalence of jobs with low pay and low quality benefits at scale. So there are a lot of pieces. I think a lot of people can see themselves in the, find the place where they can make a change, where they have levers that they can pull, and to really consider how do we move people, recognizing that there might not be a one size fits all solution because people find themselves across all these different places. And obviously our conversation today is focused on workers, but there are a lot of people that cannot work in like the formal economy for whatever reason, caregiving being a really big piece of it. And I know that falls outside of our conversation today, but just to say that, we're focused on workers today, but there are many people that we still need to be thinking about, and we should be thinking about as workers. They might just not be, in the way that we see it in the data. Something to consider too.
Great. Deborah.
I would ask us to consider how we approach healthcare. Is healthcare only for those people who are in the good jobs, and then they and their families have access? We are one of the most sophisticated countries, but when it comes to the extension of healthcare, we've tied it to work. So if you're very young, we'll help you with healthcare. If you are older, we'll help you with healthcare. If you are disabled, we'll help you with healthcare. If you have high healthcare risk, we will help you. But if you are productive and have the ability to work, it is tied to your job. And I think that is one of the fundamental principles that we should address as a country. And the other fundamental principle is we extend retirement benefits, but we don't help people understand the necessity of planning. And I'm not saying you have to plan for retirement every day, because there are unexpected circumstances where you will have to spend, but you do need to think about it every single day, because it is part of your lifelong journey of good personal health and good financial health. And I believe employers have the best waking hours of the majority of the workforce, and therefore they have a responsibility and a platform to help us think broader, have access to education and information. So from a government standpoint, this Recovery Act is raising people out of poverty. So the question I have, and I'm sure you all have more data and you can respond, is it raising people out of poverty now? And what is the long-term impact?
I think that's a great question, and that gets at my where are the knowledge gaps question from where we started. And so I love that you've elevated that now, because I think part of what we're hearing throughout is that we're in this moment that is simultaneously a moment of potentially transformational change because of COVID and because of both employer and public responses and philanthropic responses as well. But at the same time, it's nothing new. So I think like there's a lot of everything as old as new again, but we've finally I think entered what has the potential to be a transformation, and we need to figure out, what do we want to measure for whom? How do we want to track it so that we achieve the outcomes that we started with? And I think we all agree on, which is financial stability and security for all workers, regardless of your employer arrangement, regardless of your quote unquote skill level or your color or your gender or your sexuality or your immigration status, et cetera. So we have 4 minutes left, and I think what I'd like to do to give everyone a chance to just sort of voice a closing remark, because you all have so much in mind, that if there is anything that you wish we had gotten a chance to touch on based on all of the things that we've talked about, are there things you haven't yet said that you want to be sure the audience leaves with as a takeaway? And I'll ask you to keep it really brief because we have 4 minutes left, and I'll probably get in trouble with the behind the scenes for people for even tossing this out to you, but it seems worth it. One thing you want the audience to keep in mind after we close.
So if you have an opinion, have a voice, because what has happened over the years is that the voices that have mattered have really looked more at capitalism than socialism. So if you're looking at the structure and principles of how we pay, how we benefit, how we live, if you're on this call, I'm assuming you have an opinion. And then if you have an opinion, have a voice and take action.
Love it. Anmol.
Yeah, I think, there's, in getting into the specifics of a lot of the sort of policy proposals or different ideas that people have to get at, some of these problems, I think there's a lot of innovative approaches that people are talking about that have come up in the chat and the Q&As. And I would just say at the highest level that we should be very conscientious about not eroding not using these innovative approaches to either erode the critical social safety net that we have in place today, or our sense of employer responsibility for providing economic security for workers. We have the sense of a broader social compact for work and for workers that involves employers, that involves policymakers and the public sector and the state and other the key stakeholders in our economy. But I think there's a way that sometimes that the discussion around portable benefits, for example, I think it is a really important question to move the benefits from a workplace or an employer to the workers themselves, but we need to be conscientious about ensuring employer responsibility in that as well. We saw recently with Mitt Romney's proposal around expanding child tax credit or child care support, that behind that, right, was also this withdrawing or retrenchment of other social programs as well. So I think as we think about these innovative approaches, we want to make sure that we maintain that social compact, maybe expand it, and not to erode the safety net or sense of employer responsibility and economic security.
Awesome. Shada, you get the last word as our Aspen representative.
Great, no pressure. I agree with everything that has just been said. I think one thing I will flag that we didn't really get to was just when we did create that matrix for the paper, one thing that we noticed was it's really hard to cut and parse the way that we had in that paper. So thinking about who is working multiple jobs, how many people are working multiple jobs, how are people tied to an employer, what are the, I think just having a better scope of what that is, because a lot of people are kind of turning on and off income streams as they need to make up for gaps. Underscoring the kinds of values that we care about justice, about equity, about ensuring that no one who is working ends up in poverty. I think one thing I will push us on is just to be thinking broadly about what it is and what it means to work and contribute to our economy, and just not forget all of these folks that are kind of on the outskirts of this kind of conversation that we're having, something that I think a lot of us brought up about folks that are caregiving and providing other really critical supports in our domestic workforce. And so thinking about all of those things, and we put that on all of you that are listening today. It's a place that you are sitting in to make a difference and really impact the workers and the folks that you are able to and whoever you are overseeing.
Excellent. I really appreciate that we ended with a call to action to our audience. We clearly have an engaged, really smart audience because there's so many great questions in the Q&A that we just didn't have time for, but rest assured that we've seen them and all of us will, I think, take them back and take them into account as we're continuing on with our work. I want to close by just thanking Deborah, Anmol, and Shada for a great panel. We talked as we were getting ready for this panel, and it was very clear to me that this was a conversation that we were going to have nowhere near enough time to get like anywhere near complete. But I think this little snapshot of the three of you in conversation was really rich and generative, and I certainly have ideas in mind going forward. So I'm going to close us out just by noting that Emmy, who is helping us out, has put up a sign for if you'd like to receive more, if you want to stay part of this conversation, please sign up for Aspen FSP's newsletter, as well as keeping in touch with WorkRise. We have research, we have news, we have events. We are a grant maker, so if you're a researcher who's on this call working on these issues, we will have a request for proposals out in May. That's a little early advertisement there. And mostly I want to say thank all of you for taking the time to be part of this conversation and do the work, because if you have a voice, you should use it. Thank you, Deborah. And I will close us out there.